Hi, Brad. Thank you for being with us today. Could you please start by introducing yourself, spelling out your name, telling us what is your area of expertise, your title, and what would you like us to call you?
Sure. So my name is Brad Duchaine. Brad, B-R-A-D, Duchaine, D-U-C-H-A-I-N-E. And I'm a professor in psychological and brain sciences at Dartmouth. And you can call me Brad.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions for you today regarding prosopagnosia, if I pronounce it correctly, or face blindness. But before we go into the specifics, could you tell us what this is and why does it have two names, or if it's the same thing? What are the main symptoms and the treatment? So can give us a bit of an overview of what this condition is.
Sure. So prosopagnosia and face blindness are synonymous. Face blindness was a term that was coined by people who are prosopagnosic. They wanted a simpler term to try to convey what it was that they were dealing with. And people with prosopagnosia or face blindness have difficulty recognizing facial identity. They don't have difficulty with facial identity due to, say, early vision problems. They don't have a problem with their eye. And they also don't have high level cognitive problems. So it's a problem specifically with the mechanisms in our brain that are important for visual recognition.
Wow. So what are how does this manifest? How can someone manifest? And if there's an age when someone starts to manifest this, is something that you're born with?
Yeah, so there are different types of prosopagnosia. We've known for many decades about acquired prosopagnosia. And acquired prosopagnosia is when somebody has normal face recognition and then suffers some brain damage and that their abilities are damaged. And so that's obvious to people in that they have normal face recognition one day, then maybe they have a stroke and they can't recognize people any longer. So that contrast is apparent to them that they really have something wrong with their visual recognition. It's only been in the last, say, 20, 25 years that we've realized that there are a lot of people out there who've never suffered any brain damage and yet have a really tough time recognizing facial identity. The way it manifests is, simply they fail to recognize people that they are very familiar with. So maybe they fail to recognize people that they work with. Often they have the most trouble when they're meeting people out of context. So they might do well if they work in an office with 10 people because they know who they're going to encounter. Whereas they run into one of those people at the grocery store, it can be anyone at the grocery store, and then they just have no idea who that person is.
So this has nothing to do with like when we don't recognize someone that we met before, which is something that happens to all of us, I guess.
Yeah, sure. We all fail to recognize people from time to time, but people with prosopagnosia, it's a common occurrence for them to fail to recognize people. And when you're not recognizing somebody, you're not recognizing somebody who you've only met a couple times. Whereas prosopagnosics are failing to recognize people that they know quite well.
What about treatment? Before I hand it over to Emery, I don't want to ask all the questions, but what is the common treatment? How does someone deal with this in a day-to-day life?
Yeah, people use a variety of strategies to try to manage it. One thing that people do is to try to focus on other information that they are good with. So they might say, every time I meet somebody, I'm going to listen very closely to their voice. And so that way, when I next meet somebody, I can compare the voice I'm hearing to the voices I have in memory. Or they might focus on hair or clothing. You hear unusual strategies. I mean, one person mentioned to me that they use teeth, and everybody's got some distinctive teeth, and so they look closely at people's teeth. These can be good sort of crutches, but they're not as it doesn't provide the instantaneous recognition that faces do for most of us.
Over to you, Emery, for more questions. Thank you so much, Brad. That was great.
Yeah, so when I was researching this, I read that they estimate as many as 1 in 50 people might have face blindness. How likely is it that, anyone who's reading or watching this at home might know someone who has facial blindness?
Yeah, it's a little hard to know. And of course, any estimate is dependent on where one wants to draw the line and say, this is prosopagnosia, this is not. But I think the 1 in 50 estimate is the best estimate that's out there. It's quite common if I give a talk about prosopagnosia to a decent sized audience that somebody will come up afterwards and say, they tell me stories and they say, does this sound like prosopagnosia to you? And if they're failing to recognize people that they know quite well, I say, it sure does. And then I test them if I have the opportunity. So there are a lot of people out there who have prosopagnosia. Whatever the percentage is, it's far more than we thought it was, say, 10 years ago.
Is there any way to like, is there any official test for determining if people have this?
I can't say there's anything official. I mean, there are measures that a lot of labs who work on prosopagnosia use, and we also share some of these measures with clinical psychologists and counselors who want to test people that they're working with. There's two different types of tests. One are tests of familiar face recognition, where you get, say, a set of celebrity faces, and you see how effectively, usually you crop the faces so they can just see the face and not the hair. And you see how effectively they can recognize those famous faces. And then you compare how they do to a group of normal participants. And then the other thing that people do is use tests of unfamiliar face recognition. And that's that in a test of unfamiliar face recognition, everybody has the same starting point. They've never been exposed to the faces. Then they learn a set of faces, and then they try to recognize those faces later in the test. There's a test that I developed 16 years ago now called the Cambridge Face Memory Test. That's probably the standard measure of unfamiliar face recognition. But you'd always want to have multiple measures that are trying to assess somebody's face recognition.
When I was reading about this, there was a couple articles that kind of tried to help people visualize what it might look like. A couple said could be that for some people, the facial features are almost like blurry. And I know that it's not an issue with vision. Is it like kind of when you remember like you look away from the person and you try to remember it, it's like the face is blurry, or what does it look like?
Yeah, it's probably different. There's probably different experiences for different sorts of different types of prosopagnosia, because there's a lot of ways that our face processing systems can malfunction. Um, there's a woman named Cecilia, a Swedish woman who's prosopagnosic, who maybe you ran into her. I don't know if it's still up there. She would show stones and say, imagine trying to recognize these different stones. And of course, to us, sort of stone is a stone. But I thought that was a nice way to get it across. In terms of what do they see when they see a face, there's some evidence suggesting that people with prosopagnosia, when they see an upright face, they see that face with the same precision that people with normal face processing see an upside down face. And so if you look at an upside down face, you can see there's an eyes and a nose and a mouth there. But you can't make out the face with the same precision that you can if a face is upright. You can't say, determine the person's sex as easily. You can't determine whether you think they're attractive, sort of what their expression is, all these sorts of types of information that we get from faces. We can get that instantly from an upright face, whereas for an upside down face, it's much more difficult. The reason that I think some people with prosopagnosia experience sort of upright faces as if they're inverted is that if we look at how they do on tests, people with prosopagnosia sort of score with upright faces the way normal participants score with inverted faces. And so that at least suggests there's a similarity there.
Right. And just a couple more questions. So when we were discussing this story, our team, of course it came up because Brad Pitt had mentioned it in an interview. And so we were wondering as we were talking about it, does this create any challenges for acting or does it make it difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect actors meet an awful lot of people at work, and so if it's hard to keep track of people, that's going to be a challenge. I mean, it's an especially difficult situation that somebody like Brad Pitt is in, that even before people meet him, they've seen his face hundreds of times. They can recognize him, the first time they meet him. Whereas the rest of us often have to meet people several times before we can confidently recognize them. And so Brad's at a disadvantage relative to all the people that he's trying to recognize relative to how they do with him. And so I certainly can imagine it impacts you as an actor. There are a lot of professions where it's tough. I mean, teachers have it tough if they can't keep their kids straight. I hear from people who work in sales, and they've just got horror stories of not recognizing people they're trying to do deals with. So Yeah, there are an awful lot of jobs where it's important to be able to recognize others.
And this last question, I'll admit this was mostly my curiosity from my research process. So I read a couple, there's, like a Reddit on this and all sorts of stuff, and people were discussing how some TV shows, it's hard to watch because you can't keep track of the characters. And then I also read people discussing cartoons. And so facial features are a little exaggerated in cartoons. So is this a condition that only affects how a person recognizes like real life faces, or can it also be a challenge to say watch a cartoon?
Yeah, I think because cartoons, like you said, are so distinctive, that prosopagnosics do well with those faces. Um, I have heard some prosopagnosics say they like Star Trek New Generation because you've got a number of different sort of life forms there. And so it's easy for them to keep those faces straight. And there certainly are movies and television shows that people with prosopagnosia have a really tough time with. The one that I hear the most about is The Departed, where you've got DiCaprio, help me here, um, Mark Wahlberg, and the other guy from Boston, who I'm blanking on. They got three young guys in their, say, 30s, all about the same height. Um, and prosopagnosics are watching this show and are just mystified as why this person is doing this, and then he's doing something very different from that. And after, maybe if they talk to a friend, they realize, oh, those are actually three different characters in the show. And so, yeah, they can have a really tough time. That's one of the sort of pieces of evidence that people often use to realize that they have a tough time recognizing faces, when everybody around them has no trouble following plots because they can keep the characters straight, whereas they can't.
Great, thank you. That was all the questions I had. This was really informative.
I have a couple more. So going back to the celebrities who suffer from this, does that mean that it can happen to anyone? Like anyone can suffer from prosopagnosia?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think 1 out of 50 people have real difficulty recognizing faces in daily life, you're going to get people from all walks of life. I read it sometimes even about politicians. You think that's a job where you really want to be able to recognize people when you're glad handing. And I've read about politicians who, I mean, in fact, John Hickenlooper, who's a senator from Colorado, talks openly about his difficulties recognizing faces. And there are others who I've suspected that they have a tough time recognizing faces.
Well, thank you, Brad. This was great. Our last question is there anything that we didn't ask you regarding this topic that you think it's important for our audience or general public to understand?
Sure, I'd say there's two things. Well, one thing is sort of, you might say, well, what causes it? And we know that prosopagnosia often runs in families, and we know that in the general population, most differences in face recognition ability are due to genetic differences. And so, was I hung up there?
Yeah, just for like a bit. If you can repeat that last bit,
Sure,
that'd be great.
sure. One question is, what causes developmental prosopagnosia? And we know that prosopagnosia often runs in families. And we also know that in the general population, differences in people's face recognition ability are largely due to genetic differences. And so it appears that genes probably are the main explanation for why people differ in their face recognition ability, and why some people are so extreme that they're prosopagnosic. And then the last thing is, if people think they're prosopagnosic, we'd love to hear from them, because we are always looking for new research participants, and they could go to our website, faceblind.org, to find out. And we've got a contact form there that they can get in touch with us.
Extremely helpful. Thank you so much. We'll let you know if we have any follow-up questions, and we'll do our best to send you the link when the story becomes available.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you so much.